Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy for our AP Government Redesigned exam series, where today is part 2 of our lesson on federalism. In our last lesson, we touched on the ongoing debate over state versus national sovereignty, exemplified by President Woodrow Wilson's quote in 1908, where he states that the question of states to the federal government is the cardinal question of our constitutional system. It cannot be settled by the opinion of one generation because it is a question of growth. And each successive state of our political and economic development gives it a new aspect, makes it a new question. And that sums up the theme of our lesson today. We can see from this chart that national spending has increased dramatically over the course of U.S. history. And as government spending and our national deficit rise, the size of the federal government has been a major source of debate. The election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the midst of the Great Depression saw a major turning point in the evolution of federalism in the United States, which we will get to in a few minutes. But we will see that the relationship had changed before that. And just a reminder, teachers, that this PowerPoint with a wide variety of materials are available at Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy at Teachers Pay Teachers by clicking the link below this video. So the first key term you should know for your exam is dual federalism. Sometimes we call this layer cake federalism, in which there is a precise separation of national and state powers, and that's how the country started. We use the word sovereignty in this course a lot, and sovereignty implies having governing power with no higher ruling authority above you. In early U.S. history, dual federalism was widely accepted, as most people rarely left their states. And while a small percentage of the population was involved in interstate and even global commerce, the vast majority of business was done at the local level. So people were logically tied to their state or local government. Leading up to the Civil War, the debate over slavery and tariffs brought up questions over whether states could nullify federal laws, or the quote-unquote compact theory that states had entered into the Union created by the Constitution and could simply break that compact that they had agreed to when ratifying the U.S. Constitution. Sadly, it would have to be resolved by America's bloodiest war. And while dual federalism lasted after the Civil War, its boundaries were being pushed by an ever-evolving nation. The size and scope of the federal government had greatly increased during the Civil War. Nothing compared to what it is today, but certainly compared to the early republic. We saw 3 amendments added to the U.S. Constitution in 5 years after the Civil War, sometimes referred to as the Civil War or Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th Amendment in 1865, which abolished slavery, and the 15th Amendment, which gave African American men the right to vote. And again, after the Civil War, the nation was rapidly expanding, both population-wise and geographically, especially westward, and America was increasingly industrializing. The question of racial relations was also increasing, with the freedom of 4 million slaves. So many were looking to the federal government to step in on these issues. While the legislative and executive branches have greatly influenced the relationship between the federal government and the states, it was the U.S. Supreme Court that played a central role in defining federalism in our modern era, and it provides us with 3 of our must-know cases for the AP exam. One amendment, in particular, that was passed after the Civil War, which was intended to help the newly freed slaves, was the 14th Amendment. And this amendment continues to play a major role in not just defining federalism, but our civil rights and civil liberties as well. One line in the 14th Amendment states that, quote-unquote, no state shall deny any person due process or equal protection of the laws. No states. The 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause and our nation's race relations was put to a semi-early test with the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson. The case was over a state law forbidding black and white passengers to ride in the same railroad cars, and it was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. They acknowledged the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause as it applies to state laws, but sidestepped the issue, saying segregation was okay as long as it was quote-unquote separate but equal. In essence, they were legalizing segregation and giving the green light to Jim Crow laws throughout southern states. And this leads to another key term you need to know: incorporation, or selective incorporation. Before the 14th Amendment, the Bill of Rights only applied to protections from the federal government. With the 14th Amendment's quote-unquote no state mandate, the Bill of Rights were incorporated into protections from state governments as well. And yet, this was still the era of dual federalism in the United States, and the Supreme Court was very reluctant to rule against state laws. We see this as late as 1925 in a case, again, one that's been removed from AP Central, but one that helps explain incorporation, and that was Gitlow versus New York, over a man arrested for promoting communist beliefs. And even though the U.S. Supreme Court sided with New York, their ruling put New York and all of the other states on warning that they had better start upholding or incorporating the Bill of Rights, in this case, freedom of speech and the press, or they were going to step in. Again, this is the concept of incorporation. We see in a modern case, one that you are required to know for your exam, this issue of incorporation in a case called McDonald versus Chicago, over a city ordinance that in effect banned the purchase of new firearms in the city of Chicago. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled against the city, citing the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution as protection against local governments, and therefore, in effect, incorporating to all states and local governments who might try to restrict gun rights too much. In simple terms, McDonald versus Chicago, which my students examined in more detail in class, incorporated the Second Amendment to state governments. So let's backtrack to look at federalism as it applies to commerce. The Second Industrial Revolution that exploded in America in the latter half of the 19th and early 20th centuries had a profound effect on the social, political, and economic aspects of the U.S. as an increasingly mobile population often left their states to relocate in cities where the jobs were. Throughout most of it, the federal government upheld a laissez-faire or hands-off approach to regulating business, going as far as saying corporations were entitled to the same rights as people. This launched what is referred to as the Progressive Era, during which Congress initiated the 16th Amendment, which created an income tax as tariffs had dramatically decreased with free trade, and the 17th Amendment, which allowed the people to vote for U.S. senators instead of being appointed by state legislatures. However, the Supreme Court struck down a federal law prohibiting the interstate trade of goods made using child labor. Again, dual federalism wasn't dead, and they argued that manufacturing fell under intra-state commerce. Well, all of this would change with the Great Depression and FDR's massive New Deal program, creating federal relief agencies to deal with a problem that the states were obviously unable to handle. We see the creation of Social Security to help those who had lost their retirement savings and the unemployed. And this program continues to be a major topic of discussion as we worry about its solvency. FDR created the FDIC, or Federal Deposit Insurance, to protect your money if the banks go out of business. Now, we must point out that he didn't really create it, but he pushed Congress to create it. Remember, Congress has the power under the Commerce Clause to regulate any financial trade that takes place over state lines. And by the time of the Great Depression, following the Industrial Revolution, with the rise of massive national and global corporations, almost all trade was interstate. But a question that continues to arise is, has the federal government gone too far in regulating business using the Commerce Clause? Well, the U.S. Supreme Court initially thought some of FDR programs did go a little too far, striking some down as unconstitutional and leading to FDR's threat to increase the size of the Supreme Court, something you probably learned about last year in this packing the court scandal. However, the court did seem to come around to his views on interstate commerce, that most trade falls under the jurisdiction of the federal government. In 1938, he pushed Congress to pass the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is still in effect, instituting a national minimum wage, a 40-hour work week with overtime pay, and a ban on child labor. And this marks the beginning of what we call cooperative federalism, in which the national, state, and even local governments work together to deal with issues. Sometimes we refer to this as marble cake federalism, as the responsibilities of the various levels have become all mixed together. After all, it wasn't just the Great Depression that had demonstrated the need for federal programs, but World War II and the massive mobilization of the war effort on the domestic front and the economic boom that followed the war. With the creation of interstate highways and the relocation that had taken place during the war, the U.S. people were even less tied to their state governments as they had once been. So we're going to look at federalism through the lens of two pressing problems, civil rights and poverty, that the federal government looked to address at the state level in the 1950s and 60s. Brown versus Board of Education, a required case that we'll come back to during civil rights, is one that I find my students are usually somewhat familiar with. Today we're going to look at it in its significance on federalism, in which the Supreme Court ruled that state laws segregating schools were unconstitutional, another turning point in the relationship of federalism. The Commerce Clause was also used after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ended legalized discrimination in public accommodations, and Supreme Court rulings greatly influenced the federal government's ability to deal with states that were violating rights of minorities. Finally, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 gave the federal government the power to oversee elections in some states that had been known for voter discrimination. Again, a power that had once exclusively been reserved to the states. Again, we're going to go into more detail when we get to our civil rights section, but it's important to notice how the federal government started stepping into areas that had been reserved to the states. Finally, Lyndon B. Johnson, who signed the Civil and Voting Rights Acts, marks another turning point in federalism in his quote-unquote war on poverty, where he introduced social welfare programs and health care. He knew he would need the states to implement his programs, so he offered them grants or federal money. Johnson pushed Congress to create Medicare and Medicaid, free health care for the elderly and poor, both of which have been in the news a lot recently with the Obamacare debates and many Democratic presidential hopefuls pushing for universal health care. And this brings us to our last category of this lesson, which is fiscal federalism. How federal money has increasingly changed the nature of the relationship between the national and state governments. Grants and aid, one of your key terms, is money from the federal government to the states, and the practice has been around since the beginning of the nation. But it is the massive amounts of money that has greatly changed the nature of federalism. Originally, money given to the states was for specific projects, and these are known as categorical grants. There's two types of grants you need to know: categorical grants and block grants. Categorical come with strings attached. Basically, the feds tell the states how to spend the money. But starting in the 1970s, there has been a push towards block grants, in which the feds provide states with money to deal with a particular issue, like, say, healthcare, but allow the states a fair amount of leeway as to how best to spend the money. As you can imagine, states much prefer block grants to categorical grants, as it gives them power to deal with the issues the way they feel is best for their state. And the political party most associated with this shift to block grants is the Republican Party. Starting with President Nixon in the 70s, many Americans called for a decrease in federal welfare spending and to shift responsibility back to the states in what your test will refer to as quote-unquote devolution. The practice of devolution was furthered under President Reagan, who instituted what he referred to as new federalism, when he proclaimed the era of big government was over, and this included welfare reform and more block grants. In the mid-1990s, Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich announced that 1960s-style federalism is dead. He and many on the right wanted to see an end to what are called unfunded mandates, in which the federal government requires action from the states, but provides insufficient or no funding for it. Examples you should know of unfunded mandates include the Clean Air Act to reduce emissions from cars and factories, which a lot of states argued hurt their economies, but were not provided with money to implement these new regulations. Another example is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which required public buildings and transportation to be wheelchair accessible, costing states billions of dollars. In 1996, President Clinton and the Republican majority-controlled Congress signed the Welfare Reform Act, which reduced spending and placed limits on eligibility to social welfare programs, giving the states much more discrepancy in dispersing the federal funds, which had been cut down quite a bit. Even the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in when Congress passed a law creating gun-free zones near schools, leading to another required must-know Supreme Court case, U.S. versus Lopez. As public safety has traditionally been a state responsibility, the court wanted to know what rationale did the feds have to pass such a law. The federal government claimed that the Interstate Commerce Clause gave them the right to regulate possession of firearms, in this case, near school zones. The court ruled that the federal government had stretched their definition of interstate commerce a little too far and struck down the law, as well as striking a blow to the U.S. Congress's use of the Commerce Clause. So has devolution shifted power back to the states? Well, two recent events have complicated that matter. 9/11 led to the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, giving it sweeping powers to oversee state and local cases of suspected terrorists, something we'll come back to. And the financial crisis of 2008, in which the federal government had to bail out the banking, insurance, and automobile industries, both demonstrate the lasting importance of federal regulations and policies. And this relationship between the national and state governments is one that will continue to change and evolve. In our next lesson, we are going to look at Congress, but before we do, let's review. So, define dual federalism. Well, dual federalism is when the national and state governments have defined distinct roles and responsibility and are sovereign in their own sphere. What's the nickname given for dual federalism? Remember our cakes? Layer cake federalism. When did dual federalism exist? Well, you could say from the early start of the Republic all the way up to really FDR's New Deal. What does the 14th Amendment provide and say that's kind of vague, but it's an important one in federalism, especially its part where it says state laws cannot deny due process or equal protection under the laws. The Great Depression saw a shift from dual federalism to this type of federalism. Think of them working together. Cooperative, aka marble cake federalism. What were some programs instituted by FDR's New Deal? Social Security, FDIC, a national minimum wage, and many more programs that would impact the states. Johnson's Great Society program instituted this type of federal program: social welfare. What are grants and aid? Money from the federal government to the state governments. Define categorical grants. This is money from the feds to the states that usually comes with strings attached. How about block grants? This is money from the feds to the states that gives the states more leeway about how they're going to use that money. Define devolution. This is the idea of returning power and responsibilities back to the states from the federal government. What did Reagan and Nixon call their type of federalism, mostly associated with Reagan? New federalism. Define unfunded mandate. These are federal regulations which impact the states without the money for the states to pay for them. What are two examples of unfunded mandates that we looked at? The Clean Air Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. What was the impact of U.S. v. Lopez? The Supreme Court decided that the U.S. Congress had stretched their powers under the Commerce Clause just a little too far. And that is it. I want to thank you guys for watching. Be sure to subscribe, because up next we are going to look at the legislative branch, a huge part of your AP exam. And just a reminder, teachers, that this PowerPoint with a whole variety of resources are available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Just click the link below this video or search for Miss Raymond's Social Studies Academy at Teachers Pay Teachers. Again, guys, thanks for watching.